This is an asthma inhaler. It contains the active ingredient salbutamol, which widens my airways when I'm experiencing asthma. If I were an elite athlete, which you may be surprised to know I am not, I am only allowed to have four-puff doses of this in one 24-hour period. Any more than that, and I need a therapeutic use exemption, or a TUE, to prove that I have asthma, because any more than that quantity is considered a performance-enhancing dose for non-asthmatics. However, as I'm plugging away on a grueling Tour de France mountain climbing stage, which you may again be surprised to know I've never actually qualified for, I'm fully allowed to pop as many no doses as I like, since not even highly concentrated caffeine is prohibited, despite it having what we'd probably call stimulatory effects. So how does this line get drawn? What substances does WADA allow and outlaw, and how do they test for them? And is there a drug out there that can make even me an elite athlete? Over 200 substances and performance-enhancing methods, such as blood doping or sample tampering, are currently on the World Anti-Doping Agency's banned list. Some are permanently banned, some are only during competition, and others only in certain sports. The ban list gets updated regularly as new drugs are developed. A drug or method will be added to the list if it satisfies two of the following three criteria. 1, that it is or potentially is performance enhancing. 2, that it is or potentially is harmful to an athlete's health. And 3, it violates the spirit of sport. WADA has the final say on whether a drug or method meets the criteria, so unfortunately the nerds are in charge of what the spirit of sport is. To check athletes aren't using substances that are on the ban list, national anti-doping authorities have to collect blood and urine samples from athletes without notice, whether they're competing or outside competition. Usually about 250,000 urine samples and 25,000 blood samples are collected globally from athletes each year, half of which are collected during an athlete's competition and half of which are outside it. Random out-of-competition testing is vital to make sure athletes aren't trying to roid up when they're out of the competitive spotlight. So I hope there was no global pandemic a year out from the Olympics that caused testing rates across the world in all sports to drop by 80 to 90%. Ha ha ha. So how do you collect a usable sample from an athlete? Well, I imagine you just asked nicely. But you also use what's called a Mareck kit to collect two samples, whether it's blood or urine, an A sample and a B sample. These bottles have numbers on them rather than names, so laboratories don't know whose samples they're testing, unless someone's name is 1017432-38. So Elon Musk's kid? An anti-doping official will chaperone the athlete, needing an unobstructed view of their urinating into a beaker. This process lends itself to some of the happiest professionals I've ever seen working their day job. Once the athlete's churned out at least 90 mils of wee, it's halved between the A and B sample bottles and the lids are locked on. The A sample will be analysed back at the lab, whereas the B sample will go into storage, only to be tested if something abnormal crops up in the A test and needs to be confirmed, or if further down the track, the lab decides to retest the sample with new technology. The lids of the Mareck kit bottles are designed to be impossible to open unless their lids are destroyed by a special laboratory machine, so any tampering with the sample will be self-evident. This system worked just fine until those dastardly Russian spies worked out a way to secretly unscrew and rescrew the lids at Sochi, pulling the old switcheroo between dirty urine samples and pre-donated clean ones from the same athletes. WADA is now a lot more stringent in checking for forensic evidence of any unscrewing of a Mareck kit bottle, since the Russians decided to be all shady about it. So we've got our sample, what next? Unfortunately, we can't just pour our sample straight into some magical machine that'll immediately tell us if an athlete is doping or not. The substances anti-doping labs are looking for are in super low concentrations in blood or urine, so they need to be purified. There are many different ways to go about this, and one of the main failures of drug testing is that there's no perfect catch-all method, but there are a couple of main ones that are worth a mention. In urine, target substances are usually present as metabolites rather than their initial form. Subjecting the urine sample to hydrolysis, which is breaking it down via the use of a water molecule, converts the metabolites back to their free form, which makes them way more detectable. Chuck in a bit of acetonitrile, which removes non-interest molecules like urea, salts, and waste proteins, and you have a purified solution of target substances. Bob is indeed your uncle. Blood samples can be purified by a similar method. Adding acetonitrile will precipitate out waste proteins into big clumps so that target molecules remain purified. So now we've got a nice and pure sample to test. How do we analyse it? The purified liquid sample gets injected into a column where its component molecules move to the end of the column at different speeds, separating from each other in the process. Once separated, these molecules can be identified via mass spectrometry, which I'll explain in a little bit, as can their concentrations, which is important for substances like testosterone that only become illegal at a certain quantity. Gas chromatography operates off a similar principle, where this time the liquid sample is vaporized and run through an ultra-thin tube that can be up to 100 meters long, over which the component molecules separate out again. This method is particularly useful for detecting the presence of anabolic steroids, again using mass spectrometry. Mass spectrometry, or mass spec, is a really accurate method of identifying exactly what substance an athlete is carrying in their blood or urine. Each different blood or urine component molecule, as separated out by chromatography, is fired through a machine where it's hit by an electron beam, after which its molecular weight is measured by a detector. The firing of this beam can cause the molecule to split into different fragments. So we can identify the molecule not only by its total weight, which two molecules could share, but also by the weights of the fragments it splits into, which will be unique to a particular molecule, since molecules split in different ways based on their different structural components. A particular variation of this method, called isotope ratio mass spectrometry, is especially useful for determining whether the testosterone in a person's blood is natural and legal or manufactured and illegal, since the two forms carry different percentages of different carbon isotopes, that is, carbons with different numbers of neutrons. Jimmy neutrons in a person's blood or urine. The recommended Jimmy neutron content for a person's blood or urine is always 0. Pharmaceutical steroid products are produced from soy plants, which utilise much less carbon-13 than humans and have a much lower C13 to C12 ratio than humans. Therefore, if a person's testosterone C13 to C12 ratio is at least 0.003% lower than their C13 to C12 ratio for other natural non-doping steroids in their system, like cholesterol, they will be considered doping. When these tests are run on the A sample, one of two things will happen. It'll return negative for prohibited substances, as is the case after 98% of tests, or it'll return positive and produce an adverse analytical finding. In this case, the B sample will be tested to make sure we haven't accidentally got a false positive, and if it also tests positive for a prohibited substance, the athlete will likely go on to receive a ban, unless they have a therapeutic use exemption for that substance. Regardless of whether the test is positive, the info it provides is collated into what's called an athlete biological passport, or ABP. This is a digital record of an athlete's personal values for specific natural molecules that can be affected by doping, such as hemoglobin or testosterone, as compiled across all the drug tests they've ever had, to determine what their natural baseline levels are for each of those molecules. This is how Caster Semenya, a South African track athlete who has naturally high levels of testosterone, can be differentiated from a drug cheater who has equal levels of testosterone, but only after a significant spike from their normal. This method catches the effects of doping rather than individual doping molecules, which is great for catching methods like autologous blood transfusion, where the molecules in question aren't foreign, only their quantities are. It also means you can catch cheaters for as long as they're experiencing the benefits of their cheating, which often far exceeds how long the drugs they took are in their system for. As ABP data improves, tests based off it return positive in roughly 14% of cases. So with all this supposedly rigorous testing, how do only 2 to 14% of tests return positive, when upwards of 43% elite level Olympic sport athletes are doping? Well, it turns out the tests themselves are reasonably good at catching athletes when illegal drugs are in their system. The problem is, athletes are barely tested when the drugs are in their system. Flick over to the next video to find out how doping athletes can gamble the testing system and get away with it.